My name is Henry Adams, and I'm the moderator of this session on tradition and innovation in the visual arts. And I'd particularly like to thank Jim Leach and also to welcome everyone, but particularly our Chinese visitors who've come so far to be here. I'm going to start off with some opening remarks and then pass things on to the others on the panel. China has the oldest, grandest, most continuous civilized culture in the world. And in China, painting and the visual arts have developed in a fashion very different from in the West, both in form and in social content. Many of these differences are associated with the fact that in the West, painting was largely the province of skilled artisans who were working to please rich patrons, and were craftsmen who were focused on techniques of accurately representing the visual world. In China, on the other hand, the painting that was most highly esteemed until recently was largely created by scholar officials. It was more personal and intellectual in character, and it was closely associated with calligraphy and poetry. In the 3rd century BC, an enormous Chinese empire was formed with borders that are very close to those of China today. The founding of the empire largely eliminated a class that had dominated Chinese culture before, that of warrior aristocrats, who were replaced with scholar officials. Small armies of literate bureaucrats were necessary to organize the huge empire, for example, to muster 1 million men to form the Great Wall of China. While scholar officials were generally in conflict with other groups, such as court eunuchs, regional clans, or the families of empresses, in the end they remained powerful because the empire could not function without them. At this point, calligraphy became the preeminent form of Chinese art, a status which it retained for 2,000 years. For several thousand years, good handwriting was the main way of gaining official and financial success. Good handwriting indicated both education and moral character. As Confucius declared, a man's character is apparent in every brushstroke. Styles of handwriting became a matter of dispute, as is indicated by Zhao Yi's polemic against the cursive script, which was written in the 2nd century AD. Closely allied with calligraphy were painting and poetry, which were also created with the same instrument, the wonderfully flexible Chinese brush. Many of the greatest painters, such as Wang Wei, who were key figures in the development of landscape painting, were also important poets. And in this famous work by Zhen Chao, the painting is written and the poem is an intrinsic part of the landscape. Because of its close connection with calligraphy and poetry, and because of its connections with the scholar class, Chinese painting developed in a way very different from the West. Whereas in the West, figure painting became the dominant form of expression, figure painting ceased to be the genre practiced by major Chinese artists after the Tang Dynasty, and landscape became the central form of expression. In contrast to the West, the nude never played an important role in Chinese art. The reasons for this are hard to pinpoint, but I think it's apparent that quite early in China's history, certainly by the Song Dynasty, the theme of escape from the corruption of the court became a major theme. By connecting with landscape, the Chinese scholar could reestablish a connection with the larger harmony of the universe. One of the most fascinating aspects of Chinese art is that rather early, it abandoned the representation of reality as its central goal. For one thing, calligraphy affected attitudes towards painting, since the bone energy conferred by the calligraphic line was considered as important as literal resemblance. Indeed, brush effects that differed from those of writing were considered inferior. The 9th century connoisseur Zhang Yangwan, for example, admitted that moistening silk and spreading ink on it produced atmospheric effects that were evocative of mist, but denied that this was true painting because no brushstrokes were visible. It's like the ink splashing of some landscape painter, which is not true painting, he declared. So in essence, quite early traditional Chinese painting had two goals in tension with each other: to resemble the world and to resemble calligraphy. And in fact, this situation is more complicated, for in China, the effort to create resemblance was always an attempt to capture some inner essence as well. The American relationship with China goes back very far, almost to the beginning of the American Republic. New England has a harsh landscape and few natural resources. From the beginning, New Englanders turned to the sea for livelihood, and foreign trade played a major role in the commercial development of the American Republic. Going in surprisingly small sailing ships, merchants from Ceylon and Boston sailed to China and brought back tea and porcelain. Indeed, plates made in China with the willow ware pattern can still be found in many American homes in New England, and they became so popular that they're still manufactured today. In the mid-19th century, Oriental art began to have a major influence on American painters as well as on painters in France, first through Japanese prints and later through more sophisticated forms of Japanese and Chinese art. Two Americans were the leading pioneers in this development: James McNeill Whistler in England and John Lafarge in the United States. One could argue that their interest in Oriental art was the major step that led to the creation of modern art and to a new form of vision. Oriental art forms showed that the world could be seen in many different ways and introduced new ideas about color, pattern, composition, and expression. Ironically, Oriental influence is pervasive in many of the forms of art that are often considered most American, such as the paintings of Winslow Homer and the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. American knowledge of Chinese art is complicated by the fact that Americans first came to know Chinese art from a Japanese perspective. And as we know, China's relationship with Japan is a complicated subject. The Japanese turned to China as a model in the Nara period, and all Japanese art from that time is to some degree modeled on that of China. But the Japanese did not always fully understand Chinese art and Chinese culture, and political tensions between the two countries have often been a problem, notably in the early 20th century. The most influential figure in shaping American views was Ernest Fenollosa, who after graduating from Harvard went to Japan to become professor of philosophy at the University of Tokyo. At the time, the Japanese were turning away from their own traditions. Fenollosa was able to acquire a major collection of Japanese art, which is now in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And he also went on to write the first comprehensive history of Oriental art, Epochs of Chinese and Japanese Art. While his starting point was Japanese art, in the course of his historical research, Fenollosa discovered that the creative sources for Japanese achievement lay in China, and much of his later career was devoted to studying Chinese art, although largely with the guidance of Japanese scholars. In some ways, this Japanese perspective may have skewed Fenollosa's view of Chinese art. Basically, he revered the work of the earlier periods, the Han, the Tang, and the Song dynasties, but regarded later Chinese art as decadent. Fenollosa was particularly fond of the Song tradition of monochromatic ink painting, which provided a basis for the monochromatic ink painting of Japan through the creations of the monk Sesshu, who had actually spent time in Chinese monasteries. A weakness of this view is that it did not pay much attention to the literati tradition, to painters such as Dong Qichang, and the literati tradition of later Chinese painting is less well appreciated in the West. In many ways, I think Dong Qichang is as important to Chinese art as Cézanne is to modern European art, But perhaps people in China may also have trouble with figures like Dong Qichang because of his connections with the imperial system and some of its decadent aspects. And in popular form, Fenollosa's ideas were carried on by his disciple Okakura Kokuzo in his lyrical book about Oriental thought, The Book of Tea. Essentially, Okakura traced the beginning of what he called the tea aesthetic to the Taoists, such as Lao Tzu, and then traced how this tradition evolved into Zen Buddhism in Japan. In America, Fenollosa's ideas about Oriental art influenced not only historians and scholars, but practicing artists, poets, architects, and painters. In painting, Fenollosa's ideas had enormous influence through the work of his disciple, Arthur Dow, who served as his assistant curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Dow's ideas were summed up in a book titled Composition, with nearly as many pictures as words, which reshaped the thinking of an entire generation. Basically, Dow argued that painters since the Renaissance, and he particularly faulted Leonardo da Vinci, had misunderstood the true principles of art by laying stress on representation. Such an emphasis ultimately led to a mechanical approach, since it made the artist a mere copyist and stifled his creativity. Instead, Dow felt the essence of art lay in creative design, which should emanate from the artist's inner self. And Dow had wonderful diagrams in his book, which he used to stress that the artist's most difficult task was that of creating an abstract framing. And he talked about how this is not a power derived from nature, neither is it something to be acquired after learning to draw. It's the foundation on which the artistic work rests. Oriental art, in short, was a major influence on what is probably the single most important development of 20th century modern art, the development of abstraction. In the 19th century, Americans and Europeans considered themselves superior because they had developed Renaissance perspective and more exact methods of representation. But in the 20th century, with the rise of abstract art, Chinese and Japanese art has become recognized as an art form with different goals, in many ways superior and more sophisticated in its qualities than Western painting. Painters in China in the Tang Dynasty and even earlier struggled with many of the issues of the most radically modern Western painters of our time. Here, for example, you can see that Jackson Pollock on the right is writing his name in a fashion that is very similar to what Chinese calligraphers did over 1,000 years earlier. In fact, he was clearly imitating the Chinese. Let me present just one more thought before summing up, and it's that English and Chinese are very different languages and in fact belong to different families of languages. Most of the modern languages of the world go back to the time when agriculture was started about 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. English grows from the Indo-European language, which started in southeastern Turkey and spread into Europe. Chinese grows from languages that started in China. Consequently, our languages are different not only in their words, but in their way of organizing reality and making connections between things. Let's remember that our languages present two different pictures of reality, as different as yin and yang. To understand each other, we need to reach beyond the ways of thinking and speaking with which we're most familiar. I hope that we can consider some of these matters in the discussion that follows. In the realm of ideas, I think this conference has two purposes. First is to consider where Chinese artists and scholars should turn for inspiration, whether to Western art and Western scholarship or to ancient Chinese traditions of calligraphy, painting, and poetry. Can it successfully draw on both sources? If the Chinese draw from their own culture, how should they modify Chinese traditions to reflect a society that is no longer class-bound and rigid in its hierarchy? If they borrow from the West, how should they modify their sources to fit the needs of people whose fundamental culture is not Western, but Chinese? Second is to consider what Westerners should learn from Chinese art. How can Chinese principles of art and thought help us revitalize Western art and also revitalize art history so that it is global rather than narrow in its art look? And can Chinese art help us to more deeply understand the Chinese people and work with them for mutual benefit at a time when China is rapidly moving to world leadership? But perhaps the biggest challenge of this conference is a practical one. We represent different professions in the art: painters, calligraphers, sculptors, art historians, museum curators, and other professions as well. China is growing very fast. It's become a major center of modern art and has created thousands of new museums. How should we carry further with this process of cultural exchange, and what should we do so that this conference is not an isolated event, but the beginning of a longer dialogue? And I sort of throw those ideas to get things started, and now we're going to hear from Shenghong, who's Executive Vice President of China Calligraphy School of the Chinese National Academy of the Arts.
李胜宏是中国国际艺术院书法学院的执行副总裁。
谢谢主持人的讲话。
Thank you, moderator.
然后在讲这个题目之前
Before I start my presentation, I'd like
因
to
为这是一个很难
say a
讲的
couple of
命题
things.
因为在
This is a difficult
我带了
theme.
一个光碟，这是
I
中
brought
国
a
书法的光
CD
碟
about Chinese
中
calligraphy.
国书法去年
Last
10月
year
份
in
获得了
October,
联合国教科文组织
it won
把中国书法列入人类的非物质文化遗产代表作。
cultural heritage
然后我想把这个
status
放一
with the
下，
UN.
由于
I'd like to
刚才
play
有
it.
技术的原因
Due
没
to
有放
technical
起来，很遗
difficulty,
憾。那么
I
我觉
wasn't
得
able
这是
to
一
do
个比较
that.
困难的事情，
So
因为
it's
据我的经验，
in my
对
experience,
没有东方文化背景
without
对汉字
background knowledge of
这个对上
the
海
Chinese
进行
language
书法的介
and
绍的时
history,
候是有
it's very
很大难
difficult
度
to
的。
communicate calligraphy.
那么我想，
So
正因为这样，有必要
because of that, it will be necessary to use this
然后对中国的
opportunity
书法、中国的
to
传统的艺术做一个必要的
to
阐述。
have
那
a
么到这来，我也
basic
有一些
description
意
of
外。
Chinese calligraphy.
昨天看一下这个，
Another thing I want to mention is yesterday
我发现
at an art museum
关于书法的书很少，我仅仅
or
找到
library,
一本，
I
而且这一本
found
是
very few
由
books
中
on
国人写的
calligraphy. One of them was
讲到的
written by
书法的
a
一些很
Chinese,
基本的一些
and
皮
it
毛
only
包括
talked,
它的结构
only had very
画法
superficial
这样一些最基本的东西
description
没有深入
about
到
calligraphy.
书法的核心的东西。
It didn't
书
go
法经过
into
几千年的发
depth
展，
and
它
it didn't go
已
to
经
the
是中
essence.
国文化的一个代表性的符号。
Calligraphy
今天
is
上
a
午
prime
做过
form of
这个
art in China.
几位专家讲的
Several scholars this
老子的
morning
孔子的
talked
实际上在我
about
们的书法里面
Lao Tzu
都有
and
记载。
Confucius. They can be found in calligraphy.
那么，我想呢，就借这样一个机会，
So
那么我选择了一个角度，那就是中国
I
的
choose
书刻
to talk from the
传
angle
统
of
艺术语言的崭新表达。
calligraphy lettering, brand new expression of traditional art language.
哎，不动，哎，懂了。那么，我想说一下，中国书法呢是
Chinese
关
calligraphy
于汉字书写的艺术。
is the art of the
而且呢，
Han
这一个方面呢，
writing.
它经过了几千年以上的发展，
Over 1,000 years,
据比较
it developed over
确切
1,000
的
years.
也是在5000年以上的一个时间啊。那么最近我注意到有一个资
Actually,
料，
perhaps 5,000 years.
在7000多年以前，
7,000 years ago, in China, in Henan, China,
早在一个
we
甲骨文上
found
面就找到了最早的
we found
书法的
perhaps
刻字
the beginning of
在这个时候
calligraphy.
就有了我们看到的3000年左右的甲
And
骨文
there
的那些完整的那样
We
写
saw
那么从这一点来看
ancient
呢，中国书
oracle
法是非常
calligraphy.
历史悠久的，
So it has a long
非
history
常独特的造型艺
and a
术。
very unique visual art form.
那么我们这里看到的这几个，
We can see
中国
here
书法的5种主要的书体。
there are 5 types.
这个是篆书，
This is
这个是隶
cursive,
书，这个是
this
草书，
running,
这个是行书，这个是楷
print,
书。
and what's 楷书？
还是使劲儿。然后呢，这个中国书法呢，它主要是根
Chinese
据书体
literature
的笔法、结构
based on different
和章法来写字，
styles.
形成一个富有美感、
It-
东方美感的一个
It
艺术作品。
transmits its beauty.
那么，这个写下最下面的这一个
The bottom example
被誉为天下第一行书的
is
南
honored
亭
as
序，
the
它是由中国
is written by Nanting
一
Xu,
个
who's
魏晋时期的一个书法家
a
叫
Benang
王羲之，
calligrapher.
也被后人封为书圣的王羲之他的作品，这是一个非常有名的作品。
A very, very important, famous work.
那么从历史上看，历代的皇帝都
And
非常喜欢书法，
all emperors
他们
liked
以字取士，
were very fond of
字写得好，
calligraphy.
做官，而且可以做得很大。
If you are good at calligraphy, you can have
在中国
you
历史
can
上
obtain high
也有
ranking in office.
少数民族入主中原，
And
当皇
there are
帝的这样一个时期。
minority
在这个时期呢，
leaders
少数
who
民族出
became
身的，他们
officials
不使用汉字，但
and
是也慢
they
慢地
didn't,
被
even though they didn't know
对书法产生了非
Han
常突
language,
破的兴趣。
they later on acquired such skill.
这个都是皇上写的字儿。
These are all works by emperors. This is back in the Song Dynasty. He's not a very good ruler, but he was an outstanding calligrapher.
这个是元代
This was
的一个皇
written
帝。
by an Yuan Dynasty emperor.
这是清代的乾隆皇帝。
This is by Qianlong from the Qing Dynasty.
这个是新中国的建立者
And this is
毛泽东主席的书法，
by
用
Mao
非常
Zedong.
写得非常的好，一直到现在，
And
中国大陆有很多地方都有毛主席
many
的字体。
You can see his work in many places in China.
经过几千年的发展，这个书法已经成为一个代
So
表性的中国文化的
calligraphy really has become a important landmark of Chinese culture over a few thousand years.
对，而现在呢，这个中国书法已经不仅仅属于中国，而是属于
Now
全世界。
Chinese calligraphy has gone beyond the borders of China.
对，那么我想这个有一个跟书法发展是同步的，甚至更早的，是中国的刻字艺术。
Parallel to the calligraphy development is
这个是我
the stone
在
rubbing.
各地去拍的一些东西。
And this is what I photographed from different other kinds of places in lots of
这是中
places.
国的，有些地方在树上糊画了。
This was actually like this was in Europe. That's in
这个是
China.
中国汉代的。
This was from the Han Dynasty.
那么我想说明的是什么呢？就是大量的
A large amount of documents show that calligraphy or stone rubbing
非常悠久的一个历史。
had a long history before the emergence
这都是
of
中国
languages.
早期的一些符号。
These symbols.
3000多年以前的甲骨文。
This oracle from 3,000 years ago.
那么石鼓文是中国最早的石刻文字，在3000多年以前。石刻文字。
Stone. No. This was back 3,000 years ago as well.
将近2000年左右的。
And this was 2,000 years ago in the Wei and Jin
这是刻在石壁上的文字，也是佛像的一个题记。
on murals. This from Tang Dynasty.
这个是唐代的，将近。
This is from the Tang Dynasty back in 1,000 years
书
ago.
法家的字儿刻在碑上面，然后很多的书法家
Many calligraphers
是刻字艺术家。
were very good stone rubbers as well.
对，这个是泰山刻石。
On Taishan, Tai Mountain.
我的按的有点问题了。行，就这么讲吧，因为时间的关系啊。
Due to time constraint, that's all I have to say.
当然，我们前面讲到了中国的书法，还有中国
We
的
mentioned
刻字
earlier
艺术，这都是历史非常悠
Chinese
久的艺术。
calligraphy and stone rubbing had a long history. And today,
产生了一个问题，那么就是如何
one challenge is
如
how
何
to
使这样一种传统的艺术
carry
随
on
着时代的发展有一种新的表现。
the heritage and have it evolve with time.
这个版本拿错了，是原来一个老的版本，那个谁
This is an older version.
昨天那个版本不对，这是删掉了，不掉了。怎么按不动了这个？哎，要使很大的劲儿嘛。哎，怎么又往回去了？啊，这个怎么意思？
How comes it's going back? It's not working very well.
这怎么回去了？这怎么操作的？行了，我就这样讲吧。就是这个操作起来，我怎么就
This one is very hard to
他
operate.
就不听我的呢？这个
It doesn't listen to me.
是我劲儿使小了吗？再帮我翻一下。我现在记不住了，然后从刚才我讲的那个地方给我翻吧。你在那儿记住一下。比个手势就翻。对，我给你。对。往前面，往前，对，哦，是我跟他之间的一点，哎，还往前，哎，还往前。这个不是那个版本，不是吗？啊，那行，那就这么找吧。那么现在呢，就是出现这么一个问题，就是传统的、古老的、
The ancient art of several thousand years of history, how do we develop it for the modern times? In the past 3 decades, Chinese calligraphy has done a lot of research in this area and made lots of progress.
最开始的这个东西是50年代在日本
In the 50s, in Japan,
产生了一种艺术，然后从80年代开始呢
there was the modern calligraphy emerged, and in the 80s it came to China.
那么这个形成了一个现代的书刻艺术，大家知道这个艺术和我们刚才看到的那些传统的书刻是不一样的。
So you can see this is somewhat different from the more classical calligraphy. Besides calligraphy, it has colors.
从2维的空间
It has
变成3维的空间，
It becomes three-dimensional.
具有一个独特的审美。
It has unique
那么这个独特的审美它主要
aesthetics,
是表现在几个方面。
which manifests in several aspects. Composition, the beauty of composition.
我们可以看一看它的构成之美，它表现思想主题的一个空间安排。
Its spatial arrangement.
它的
The bottom
是矛
one
盾，现在矛盾
shows conflict.
它既像是一个雕塑，
It's like a
一
sculpture.
个
It's both a
各自的作品
sculpture and a modern calligraphy,
很新的一个技法的支持。
and it's very innovative.
几千年来
It's not the same as the classical Chinese calligraphy.
给人耳目一新的感觉。
So it's very refreshing. The bottom one, it says the frog at the bottom of the well.
这个篆刻里面的一个景字，这下面是一个蛙。
You can see the outer frame says well, and inside is a frog.
那么第二个美是力度
The second beauty is the beauty of power
独特的一种
or strength.
和灵动的一种流动感。
It shows both the strength and fluidity.
去年
This one, last year,
刻字展里面的一个获奖
it was shown, it won an award.
那么这是
I was one of the judges.
是这么一个
It reflects
然后这个作品拿去做一个放大若干倍，做一个大的一个雕塑，也是非常美的。那么这里面呢，是它主要通过阴刻和阳刻。
It uses both the
是阳刻，
yin form and the yang form.
然后呢，这阴刻阳刻交织在一块儿，然后组成的。
And they are intertwined.
然后呢，这个也是这样的。
This one, similarly, you can see the
木头质
the
感
knife's
纹理的这种
markings,
痕迹。
and it also shows the texture of the wood.
而这一切
They all become
在
part
传
of
统的书法和刻字里面
part of the
都
art,
是没有的。
which usually is not found in traditional calligraphy. So in these, calligraphy became a part of the art form.
那么它不同于传统书法的一个很重要的
One another difference from
从原来
traditional
的二维空
calligraphy
间变成
is
一个
that
三维的空间。
it becomes three-dimensional from two dimensions.
这个线
Using
条它的力度感
unique
以
technique,
及它
you
的
can
流动
see
感都是
both
同
the
样
strength and
这是我
flexibility.
拍的一个照片，就是
This is the photo I took,
这是一个
or I
空间
found
在流动，而且
of volcanic
它还要
ashes.
这种感觉和它的感觉是非常类似的。
And to me,
而
it shows
书法里面
resemblance,
过去的是没有这种感觉的。
which is not found in previous calligraphy.
那么还有一个色彩之美。
Another beauty
书法大家知
is
道
the beauty of
书法
colors.
就是墨是黑的。
Traditionally, calligraphy is
基本是
monochromatic,
黑白两个
black
啊
and
极端
white.
美的。那么在现代的刻字里面，
Today, modern
一个丰
calligraphy,
富的色彩，
you can see
丰富的色彩
variety of
这个是
colors,
我们的传统艺术语言借鉴了西方的色彩
which is
语言
a
包括
marriage
美术
showing the
里面
marriage
的
of
一些
traditional
这个
Oriental art
色
and
彩的
Western
一些
art,
理念，然后呢，创造了一种新的美，
and with it, a
具
new
有不同
art
于以
form
往的那样一
emerges.
种非常独特的一种视觉效果。
It has very unique visual effect.
除此以外，还有肌理美。
Other than that, there is
对
also the
木头每
beauty
一种
of
材料都有自己独特的肌理
texture.
和质感，这是一
the
个
material used. They have texture, and that itself is
很
part
奇
of
特
the
的一种
beauty.
木头，这是天然的一个纹路，
It's
上
a,
面出现了
you know, you can see the
一个
natural
约束的一个
texture
一个
of
像
of this wood trunk,
对
tree trunk.
那么这是一幅作品，也很巧妙地利用了这个木
And
头的
this one is
纹路
very
来
clever, using
对
the
表现
texture itself.
这个字是永寿两个字。
These words
然后呢
say
也表明
eternal
人的
or
这个
longevity or
跟树木的
eternity,
年龄一样的这种不断的这种
which shows
能够
forever,
得到永
which
生的
trans,
这种意义在里面。
which shows forever growth.
那么这是加工的肌理，通过这个刀法，
And
然后呢
this
在上面
uses
留
more
下了很多
technique
的刀痕，
to
然后呢
add on the
笔画之间的
texture
穿插这个包括这个
between the strokes and between
外形的一些变
the
化
the lettering and the carrying medium
感
itself.
觉的美。那么我们看到，随着时代的发展，
So, as you can see,
是越来越
calligraphy
丰富
is developing,
就像今天
it's evolving,
上
and
午
it's becoming
我也讲
richer.
到它的这个老子的这个雕塑非常精美。
You saw the sculpture, wonderful examples of sculpture, which had influence of calligraphy.
夸张的一个变形。那么书法它是
Calligraphy
一个丰富的一个艺术的宝藏，在各个方面都会有很多的
in many ways
那么这是
is
中国去年
influencing other forms and being influenced by other forms as well.
在洛阳。
This is in Luoyang, and a museum,
汉字的字包括这里面
and this sculpture is actually a character.
汉字艺术的南山。
And there are also, you can see a lot of characters inside the museum.
对，那么这是现代书法的一些尝试。
This is these are
这是
experimental
汉字艺术
calligraphy.
包括书法进入现代日常生活的一些
Now,
尝试
so this is an example of calligraphy being applied to modern
那么我想说的是
artifacts.
这一切都是
So all of
随着
this
时代的发展
shows
艺术
calligraphy
不断地
is
走进生活
growing with
贴近时代
times
的
and
一种
becoming
伟大的
closer
实
to
现
life.
那么我举的这个例子，
So
现代书
I
刻的
think
艺术，便是
this
中
art
国
form
传统书法传统艺术语言的一个
is
崭新的表达。
new expression of an ancient art.
那么我觉得呢，最后要有几句话来概括
So
一下。
lastly, I would like to summarize.
艺术交流在文化交流
Cultural
之间
exchange, art
起
exchange
非常重要的作用
plays a very
我们了解
important
一个国
role
家首先从艺术角
in
度来了解。那么
multilateral
第二个呢
relationships. China has a long history of 5,000 years. It has many wonderful cultural traditions, calligraphy being one of them. Such traditional arts carry our philosophy, our values. They are integrated together. Lastly, I'd like to say exchanges like this is very meaningful, and I look forward and I hope to understand more American art as well with my respect. And I hope more American people will understand Chinese art as well. And I would support that effort with earnest sincerity and hope we can together build a harmonious society.
And now we're going to hear from Don DELBANCO, who's adjunct professor of East Asian art at Columbia University.
Thank you, Henry. I'm honored to be included in such august company, and I'd like to join my fellow speakers in thanking all the people who organized this conference for their extraordinary efforts. This is really a great occasion. My husband apologized this morning for his raspy voice. I have a cough drop in my cheek right now, so I apologize to you if I start coughing or sniffing. Being married is a great thing, but if one person is sick, the other person, you know. Anyway, in thinking over what I should say at this conference, I thought I could best address the theme of bridging cultures, and in this case, visual cultures, by giving you some examples of the ways in which I bring Eastern and Western cultures together in my own art history classes. Now, though this is a U.S.-China forum, I have to admit I'm only going to show you one example of American art. The other comparisons to Chinese art that I show are European, but I think they'll serve to make the point. And let me also say that somewhat apologetically that all my comments are directed to pre-20th century Chinese art. I apologize to all the practicing artists who are here today, but the fact of the matter is I am still trying to learn about pre-20th century Chinese art and culture. I haven't yet managed to bring myself up to present times. So I'm a real dinosaur, alas, as my children will be the first to tell you. So, okay, we start with a pre-20th century painting here on the screen. You must think that either you're at the wrong conference or I'm at the wrong conference, because what is this image doing up here on the screen? Well, I put it up because probably the most familiar painting in Western art is this one, the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. Now, if you were to ask me what the Mona Lisa of Chinese painting is, that is, which is the most familiar of Chinese paintings, it certainly would not be a figure painting. Most likely, it would be this 10th century landscape painting by Fan Quan, Travelers Amid Mountain and Streams. Now, if we compare these two iconic images from two different cultural traditions, it's obvious that they're radically different. A fundamental contrast that reflects the dominance of the human figure as central metaphor in Western art and culture on the right, versus the dominance of nature as central metaphor in Chinese art and culture on the left. So On the face of things, it might seem as if there are unbridgeable differences between traditional Chinese and Western art. Was Kipling right when he declared that, oh, east is east and west is west and never the twain shall meet? Well, of course we know the answer is no. And in fact, there are surprising parallels and overlappings between the two artistic traditions. So, for starters, in order to point out some of these parallels, I'm going to make a rather controversial statement by saying that I would like to suggest that monumental landscape painting of the Northern Song dynasty, as represented by Fan Quan over here on the left, comes as close to being religious painting as one finds in the predominantly humanist culture of traditional China. And I don't include Buddhist and Taoist art in China. These are a separate matter for a separate conference. So just compare the Fan Quan painting on the left to this diagram on the right of the 13th century Gothic Cathedral of Notre Dame at Amiens in northern France. And one sees in both images the same hierarchies of form. And on the right-hand side, it is the Holy Trinity, a kind of symbol of the Holy Trinity, versus on the left, you have the tall central monolith. If I can figure out how to operate this, let me see. The tall central monolith flanked on either side by attending peaks. And in these two images, there is a similar expression of cosmic order and the possibility for transcendence. In other words, in the space of the Gothic cathedral, the human can intersect with the divine. In the Northern Song painting, these teeny tiny little travelers down here on the bottom who are, as in their relationship to nature, it would seem as if they are as inconsequential as man is in his relationship to the Christian God in this image on the right. But the point is, the human can intersect with the divine in this cathedral, and in this painting, there is the possibility for the traveler, and take note that these figures are identified as travelers. In other words, they can move. The traveler can leave the mundane world of man down here and ascend the heights of the towering peak. Furthermore, one can see similar stylistic evolutions, interestingly enough, that occur in the Eastern and Western traditions. Consider the shift from the 10th century painting by Fan Quan on the left to the 11th century painting by Guo Xi on the right, entitled Early Spring. And if I had to choose a second Mona Lisa for Chinese painting, you could call Early Spring on the right Mona Lisa 2. So these two paintings, these two images are in some ways really the most famous images of Chinese painting. So what happens when one goes from the 10th to the 11th century? To my mind, what happens in this 1 century bears certain striking similarities to what happens from around 600 BCE to 450 BCE in Greek sculpture. That is, from the development of the so-called kouros, or young male figure on the left, to the development of the doryphorous figure, the heroic nude or victorious nude figure on the right in classical Greek art. To put things simplistically, here are the similarities that I see. While there is a monumentality of form in both the earlier Chinese landscape painting, that is this Fan Quan painting, and in the Greek sculpture of 600 BCE, there is the monumentality of form, yet there is as yet a disconnection of parts. The individual elements, that is to say, in the sculpture, arms, legs, curls of the hair, or in the landscape painting, the foreground, middle ground, and background, which exist as separate parallel planes, have not yet merged, in either case, into a unified whole. Nor is this Kouros figure in a totally balanced stance. With his locked knees, he would topple over within minutes, let us say. And furthermore, this traveler would have a lot of trouble moving from parallel plane to parallel plane, from foreground to middle ground to background, if there is no clear connection between the planes. But in later versions, in this 11th century painting by Guoxi on the left and in the Doryphorus of around 450 BCE, the different elements of the landscape, the different parts of the body have been joined into a seamless whole, perfectly balanced yet dynamic. For in both cases, the Chinese painter and the Greek sculptor have discovered a similar principle of composition. Notice that in both cases there is what one might describe as a kind of S-curve that links the parts of the landscape together, links the part of the human body together. And in fact, this is a principle in the Western context known as Contrapposto or counterbalance, which achieves a unity that not only is seamless but is dynamic. In other words, not only is the traveler now able to leave his mundane world of man and follow the S-curve up to the top of the mountain peak, but at the same time, there is a new dynamism, a new energy in this development, and therefore it is possible also to see the dynamic movements of nature. This is, after all, early spring. This is a painting about the volcanic growth that occurs, the miraculous growth that occurs in the spring season after the death of winter. And in this kind of curving movement, one can read that growth. Here too, in the Doryphorus figure, this S-curve or contrapposto pose, counterbalance, is the most balanced pose of all. He could stand in that pose forever with his weight on one hip, but the point there is that balanced as he is, if he needs to spring into action, all he needs to do is to move that back foot forward and he can enter the next battle. So balance yet dynamism, and this is a similar principle discovered by both artistic traditions. So this principle of counterbalance was described in the following way by the 5th century Greek philosopher, BCE, Greek philosopher. Unity is an inner concord of opposites, a harmony of tensions. This is what unity means in the classical Greek context. Does this not remind one, after all, of the Chinese concept of yin-yang? Now, let's go back to the seeming disparities between Chinese landscape painting and Western figure painting. In this case, on the left, a painting of rock and bamboo by the great 14th century painter Nizan, and on the right, a painting entitled Aristotle Contemplating the Bust of Homer by the great 17th century Dutch painter Rembrandt. Is there no link between these two paintings? Is Nie's painting no more than a figure of a spindly tree standing next to a not very substantial looking rock? The answer to both questions is no. And why do I say this? Looking at other images of trees by the 16th century painter, Ming Dynasty painter Wen Zhengming, and a detail from the Guoxi painting, Early Spring, that we just looked at from the 11th century, we can see in these two cases how overtly expressive Chinese landscape painting can be. Look at the dragon-like coils of Wen Zhengming's cypress trees, and Guoxi's two pine trees resembling bolts of thunder. Surely one comes to understand something of the nature of the two artists from their images. Now, Nie's rock and trees, by contrast, are very demure, tight, rigid, repressed, which is precisely the way the man was. This was a man, and we know quite a bit about his biography, who had what we would now in our modern psychiatric parlance refer to as obsessive-compulsive disorder. Nietzsche, for instance, was famously known for the following. Whenever he had guests visiting him in his home, after the guests left, he would have his servants wash down all the trees that were surrounding the entrance to his house for fear that the guests had somehow gotten their germs onto the trees. There's also, I hesitate to tell it in this company, but now that I've started, I'm going to continue. There's a slightly more risque story about Nietzsche, which also indicates or is an illustration of this obsessive compulsiveness. He was offered, a friend of his offered him the company of a famous courtesan for the evening, and he had her spend the entire night taking a bath. So that was his evening activity. Whatever the case, he was, as I say, a man of obsessiveness and compulsiveness, and that rigidity is shown, yes, in the tightness and spareness of these forms, and indeed, as his contemporaries said, he was a man who used ink as if it were gold. But does this mean that Nietzsche was paralyzed by his own limitations? Is his painting without force or personality? Let's look a little more closely. See, and let me, okay, let's look a little bit more closely. Look at these small horizontal brushstrokes that dot the surfaces of the painting. They are on the tree and they are on the rock over here. And in fact, they hit the tree and rock like spits of rain. It took a lot of force to make these brushstrokes. If you can just imagine what you have to do with your hand to make such brushstrokes, you hold the brush, you have to press it down hard on the paper or the silk, and then lift it up with speed in order to create a sense of the sort of the pointed and almost flyaway quality of the brushstroke. In other words, it's not a delicate, slowly made brushstroke. So, these brushstrokes are horizontal. They're orderly, yes. They retain their perpendicular horizontal relationship to the essential verticality and strict uprightness of the forms. this orthogonal relationship indicative perhaps of the Chinese scholar's moral rectitude in time of Mongol rule, which is when this painting was painted, but rendered with speed and force in darker ink than the pale ink of the larger forms, they impart a subtle electric energy to the painting. Imagine the painting without these strokes, and notice that in a number of cases, these strokes have no organic analogy, such as over here, for instance. In other words, they are not used to describe leaves. They aren't even used to describe vegetation on rocks. They're not branches. What they are the dynamic hand of the artist, or the inner force and strength of the man turned into visible form. Well, in fact, something similar happens in Rembrandt. And here is where the two paintings, which seem so dissimilar at first glance, really are not dissimilar. Aristotle is not moving. He is standing in silent contemplation of the legacy of Homer, whose bust is over here. There is a silence about the painting, a kind of hushed quality. Yet, the creative inspiration that Aristotle has inherited from Homer is conveyed in two ways in this painting. In part through this non-naturalistic light, which is an inner light, that sort of the inner light of the soul that is brought to the surface, but the creative inspiration that links these two great philosophers, writers, is also quite literally shown through the torrent of brushwork that explodes like fireworks on the sleeve of Aristotle, and for that matter, and it's hard to see, on the, the chain that goes around, that Aristotle is wearing around his neck. These extraordinarily powerful strokes, not used to describe the folds on the sleeve. This has nothing to do with naturalistic description, but rather to link and convey the creative energies and powers of Aristotle, Homer, and Rembrandt alike. In other words, one can follow the fireworks of these brushstrokes from his arm through this chain onto the head of Homer, or actually it goes the other way around. By putting his hand on the head of Homer, the inspiration is such that it explodes in dynamic brushwork in the chain and in the sleeve. So this is not brushwork that is analogous to visible reality. It is what reveals the inner man. In other words, as I always ask my students, how is an artist to convey abstraction, the invisible, the spiritual, the creative? How do you convey abstraction through a medium that is by definition visible? You can only do it through abstraction. One uses abstraction, abstract brushwork, to reveal abstraction. So in that sense, Nizan's landscape painting is as much a self-portrait as Rembrandt's self-portrait over here on the right. We may say that this is about nature, this is about man, but in the end, both of these are self-portraits of the artist. And from this example, I hope you can see why calligraphy and painting eventually became synonymous arts in traditional China. I am now going to skip over, alas, the next few images because I am running out of time, but they're suggestive to you, I hope. The expressive potential of brushwork. This is something that later Western artists came to recognize. Henry showed you some examples of this. And so that when you look at these two paintings, Van Gogh's Cypresses on the left and an album leaf by the 17th century painter Schüttau on the right, the images are not so much about trees and mountains as they are images of the artist's minds. All of this expressed, in other words, through dynamic brushwork. So that this mountain on the right, charged with electric current, literally emanates from the brush hand and inspiration of the artist portrayed as a tiny figure seated in the center of the painting, in the mountain hut. It is not a realistic image of a mountain, but rather a representation of the artistic mind and inspiration, as much as the turbulent brushwork of Van Gogh's painting mirrors the wildness of the inner man. So, when we look at the abstract expressionists of the mid-20th century, and Henry showed you a very similar example, we can immediately see their affinity with Chinese painters. So you have a detail of Jackson Pollock on the bottom, and a painting by the same artist of the previous, same Chinese artist of the 17th century, Schüttau, on the top. So here clearly is a fundamental link between Chinese painting and modern Western art. But let me add one more point here. Schüttau's affinity, that is, the artist of the top image, is not only with abstract expressionists. He has another link to modernist Western art as well. Consider the title and inscription on this painting of 1685 on the top. Schüttau called it 10,000 ugly ink dots. And here is his inscription, which I will read quickly, and I promise you I'm almost done. He makes reference, let me say, in this inscription to two of the most famous painters of the Song dynasty, Mi Fu and Dong Yuan. So this is what he says: 10,000 dots of ugly ink to make old me drop dead of vexation. Lots of stringy, flaccid strokes to make Dong Yuan fall down with laughter. The distance does not work. There's no sense of landscape's windings and returnings. The foreground is too cluttered. All you see are a few rude shapes of houses. But, and here are the houses over here on the left. But, he says, emancipate your mind's eye, for once and for all, from conventional molds, like the immortal who rides the wind, his flesh and bones etherealized. So this kind of in-your-face, almost rude, he is sort of, what is the word I want? He is reacting against the past. He is offering a challenge to earlier artists and throwing their tradition in their face. In that sense, you may say that his painting is a Dadaist painting, and on some level no different from Marcel Duchamp's LHOOQ from 1919 over here on the right. And like that painting, it is an art historical commentary as much as anything else. Its relationship to the past ironic. So let me just say at this point, as I am nearing the end here, this in fact was a dilemma for Chinese painters or Chinese artists of the 20th century, because if they were trying to become more, quote, modern in the 20th century by becoming more Western, well, in fact, what modernist artists in the West did in the 20th century was what Chinese artists had been doing for centuries. There is certainly in a painting like the 17th century one, irreverence, irony. There has been since, the Tang dynasty, self-referentiality, a commentary on art as art history, abstraction, expressionism. All of this was new for the Western artist of the 20th century, but it was old hat for the Chinese artist. To use a colloquial phrase, been there, done that centuries earlier. So, what was a Chinese artist to do? But Chinese artists are not alone in that. What is any artist to do in this day and age? And I also end with an irreverent image. Since I started with Mona Lisa, and I am sort of coming full circle by ending with a kind of defiling of Mona Lisa, I end with a Chinese work of art that in fact is based on, or you may say inspired by such a work as that on the right, the Dadaist work, or the pop art movement of the 1960s. And this is, of course, a piece of art by Zhang Hongtu, who did this in 1989. It is, yes, an irreverent work, but what this pairing, on the other hand, reflects is the increasing globalism of culture and the fact that there is now a certain universality of images that speak to all people, that all people can understand. In other words, it isn't that incredible dichotomy that one saw at the beginning of this talk between the Northern Song landscape painting and Mona Lisa. And when we saw Mr. Wu Weishan's moving sculptures this morning, I mean, what better evidence do we have than that art made by no matter whom can speak to all audiences today? Thank you.
Ming, who's a distinguished research fellow of the China Art Institute of the Chinese National Academy of the Arts.
Everyone, good afternoon. What I would like to talk about today is Chinese painting and its extension into today. And the main theme is the harmony between mind and images. The mind is the inner essence of Chinese culture, and the images refer to the appearance. Its harmony is the highest state. The Chinese painting has a 1,000-year history. Visual art is a main medium of Chinese art. Chinese paintings development has never departed from the mind. In traditional art language, looking from today's perspective, it guides, the mind guides our art creation. Most importantly, it's the foundation of culture. So I will talk about that from 5 aspects. The cultural experience. These 5 aspects. Establishment of the personality, appreciation for the objects, introspection, form and spirit, and then mental images. So I use some select examples to discuss those. Personality is the first. It has a lot to do with morals and characters. In Song Dynasty, Zhong Zhongyi raised the notion of painting carries the mind or the moral. So language is the skills, morals is the essence. He have an article that says loving the lotus. In it, it says living in dirty mud but doesn't get dirty. What he's trying to say is, in a lotus pond, the lotus, it grows in the mud. However, it retains its purity and fragrance. So in its language, it has a symbolic meaning. What manifests the Confucianism in Chinese culture, manifested by the lotus. So the Chinese culture has a interesting characteristics. So ordinary objects manifests high spirit. He uses the lotus to reflect morality and personality. Using these ordinary objects and acute observations, we can see that Chinese culture emphasize introspection. Personality. The second one, appreciation for the objects, using objects in life to mirror inner spirit. In Ming Dynasty, someone painted his own hut and listening to the rain outside. Where does the rain come from? He heard the rain dropping on his crops or banana leaves. That prompted thoughts. So he used certain words. Using those words, he describes what the thoughts that were prompted. He thought about the monks reading their scriptures. Like the rain on the banana leaves. Those banana leaves make him think about the horses galloping. So he used two objects, the banana leaves and the rain. But the thoughts and the images associated with those thoughts go way beyond those. So that echoes the Lao Tzu's philosophy. So in Chinese paintings, such it shows how mental images transmits using ordinary daily objects. They show the mental images of the artists. Introspection is looking inside. Chinese culture looks inward for self-perfection. I read a diary. He had a zit on his body, and he finds somebody to use some medicine, and that guy was a little too forceful. So he scolded that lad. So that kid said, "Master, in temples you asked us to do this and do that. Why in your own action you are so harsh at me?" This master regretted his own behavior. So that's introspection. Why can I ask somebody? Why can I ask others what I cannot achieve myself? So that example shows the philosophical idea of adherence. So when you know something, some kind of moral guidance, you have to be able to execute yourself. When the knowing and the acting are consistent, only then you can have credibility to others. So using the paintings, it reflects such kind of mental state, the harmony between the inside and the outside. 4, the form and the spirit, which is to discover spirit in everyday life. In Chinese calligraphy, there are 8 methods of writing. Every one of them has meaning. For example, the dot. That one dot uses analogy of the rock dropping, one short horizontal stroke. They use the that carries the power of thunders. So every stroke in the calligraphy embodies the experience of man, experience of nature by the man. So in calligraphy, people say in every stroke, it borrows some concrete objects to reflect mental images. So number 5, mental images. So that means everything that's happening in the mind. The man has to have his own inner brightness. An example: there is in a temple. There is a senior monk and a junior monk. They saw a bunch of birds playing in the water. So the junior monk wanted to chase off those birds. The senior monk says, "This is divine image. We can see that it's our luck." So he has elevated a normal image that we all can see onto a higher spiritual level. So that the Chinese people, when they view reality, they can elevate it into more beautiful image in the mind. So that's like when we see a person, we try to find beauty in him, try to see his good qualities rather than his shortcomings. So I'd like to show some actual images. This is from Song Dynasty. Plum blossoms. Let's see. This one, the shape, opening the mirror. This one looks like a mirror. In Tang Dynasty, we had mirrors shaped like that. Mirror is for people to look at themselves and introspect. So you have a branch here and this shape that shows that mental image. This one is distant mountain and floating clouds. So this looks like the mountain, and this is a profile of from the distance. This flower looks like a cloud clinging on the mountain. So this is a metaphoric. This is from Nan Song, a bird and flower painting. In this image, this is a willow branch. It's actually like a shape of a mountain, and this little bird has the sense of dynamism. So it carries two meanings. From Qing Dynasty, a famous painter in Qing Dynasty. The shape of this bird has a lot to do with his life experience. This bird looks like a rock or a mountain. So this bird, it has this on the back. It's the shape of a mountain to convey his mental image, his observation of life and the social settings. Another painting from the Qing Dynasty. Lotus and grass. Lotus grows floating on water, and this one is very meaningful. The weed or the grass. When you can see the ripple of the water. It's both grass and also a depiction of water. And for you to experience the purity of the water. Also from Qing Dynasty, a plum blossom. The branch here, the shape is very much rock-like. In Chinese painting, they use these shapes like the tree and the rock to reflect human characters in there. So from these examples, you see that in traditional Chinese art, all of these shapes and the forms reflect personality and mental images, using everyday, very ordinary objects. Lotus, water, rock, trees, very ordinary. Jin Nong's painting from Qing Dynasty. It's a big trunk and plum blossoms reflecting strength of the characters. From Qing Dynasty by Xu Gu. With these fish, it makes you experience the water and the ripple and the movement of the water. It uses the fish to show you the water. A big characteristic of Chinese landscape painting is to show the life force. This is contemporary by Qi Baishi, the master Qi Baishi. Peony flower. This was done in his late life. You can look at this as if looking at a person. Even though the shape of this flower has not very clear resemblance of a real flower. It reflects more of life in general. This is a modern times by Huang Zhou. He's known for his Xinjiang paintings for Xinjiang life. His style is very free, exuberant, and transparent. So it shows the personality of the Xinjiang people, as well as his own love for life and Liu Wenxi. In 1960s, 4 generations in the family, figure painting. You can also see the earth, the connection between the people, the human, and the earth. I believe this shows the extension of the mental images, combining both people and the landscape. Pan Tianshou, a modern artist. This uses a spatial composition. It's actually a rock. It gives you the feeling of a rock. Which reflects his pursuit of higher characters.
就这张作品呢，它猛地一看呢，像一块石头，实际上是
So,
荷花。
So it's both a rock and lotus flowers.
林风眠，
林风眠。
他的这个作品呢，表现出一种音乐的感觉。
It's very musical. This
他
painting.
的这个画的这些鸟啊，
These
它跟
birds
这些树叶呢都
and these
并列在一起。
leaves.
这里面就是说，
They are
传统的就是说，
in the same. They're sharing the same
这个
space.
就是人与物呢，
So
就是同为一体，人与物同为一体。
they're
因为
integrated
这个鸟跟树叶呢，它是一体化的，在这里面呢，它出现
and
了一种
harmonized.
像的结构。 哎，这也是现代一个很有
Another modern
很有影响
painting.
力的一个老先生、大画家，那个杨之光先生。
杨之光
70年代画的。
in the 70s. A new work in the mine.
他虽然是画的是一个
Even though
女矿
it's
工，
a
他通过
painting of a
黑色的这种墨画
woman
黑色
miner.
的墨画
He uses the
黑色的
black
这种
ink
墨画呢，和清新的这种面孔呢，
and
传达了这个
her very refreshing
一个
face.
普通工人的一种
An ordinary worker who loves her job.
作为一种闪光。
And the coal, which would be black, is shining. So a good example of mental image carried out in more modern times.
这是当代画家卢晨先生。
By Lu Chen.
他这是一张人物写生。
A figure painting.
他运用的呢，他是人物写生，他画的是一个普通劳动者。但这里面
another ordinary worker.
方法，把一个普通劳动者的那种一种坚毅。
Shows his
坚硬
strength
坚定刚强的一种气质所表现
and
出来。
endurance.
所以这个人物呢，他也有一种石头的一种浑厚感。
And it makes you feel about the rock as well, even though it's a figure painting.
这是当代大画家周世聪先生的作品。
By 周世聪。
他是画的是大凉山少数民族。
A
但是
minority
人物呢，他仍然用的是
people.
30的一种。
Still using kind of techniques for landscape, like for rocks. So their apparels are like layered rocks. So these people have sculpture-like quality.
这是这个当代画家。 郭一中先生。
This is by 郭一中。
他的作品这就叫西湖过雨。我们能看到的，他的画
West Lake after the rain. It's a typical example of mental image. The blue is leaves and water. Overall, it uses the it combines the water and the flowers. Typical mental images from landscape paintings. This is by Chen Licheng. Using the four gentleman metaphors. Snow and rocks and the tree.
这是当代画家，这是那个江宏伟先生，他的画
This is by 江宏伟。
散淡之美，他是吸收了宋代的绘画的一些特点，但是我们看到
This one looks very casual. It has Song Dynasty influence, but also a kind of more leisurely style of modern people. This is my work of a metropolitan girl. The integration of this girl with a busy urban life. Even though today the urban life can have many conflicts. I'm trying to show how they can be harmonious.
这是这个年轻画家
，a young painter Chen Ping. Some obvious mental images here. His home mountain in his dream. Reminiscing traditional arts. It's a marriage of both traditional and modern. This is by Zhang Jian. Person and Rock. Thank you.
We're running just a little bit over, but now we're going to hear from Lawrence Rinder, who's the director at the Berkeley Art Museum.
Thank you very much, and it's really an honor to be here. I will be relatively brief, so I think we'll get back on schedule. I wanted to, before I begin my formal remarks, just let you know that you're all welcome to come as my guests to the Berkeley Art Museum. For those of you who know Berkeley, we're on Bancroft Way, 2626 Bancroft Way. For those of you who are part of the delegation and are staying at the Durant Hotel, our museum is halfway between this location and your hotel, so you will pass it on your way back to the hotel. You should have a few minutes between these presentations and the banquet to stop by. Our collection goes back to 2500 BC in China and to the Renaissance in the West. We currently have a wide variety of works on view, from contemporary works, Japanese, 10th century Japanese, and one wonderful painting by Hong Ren, the Chinese artist Hong Ren, 17th century painter, and a new commissioned work by Ai Weiwei, who I'm sure you've heard of, and that is in our lobby, so you can stop by and see that. And to get your free admission, just show them your program. So they're instructed. To anyone who comes with one of these, you'll get free admission. You won't have to pay. So the title of our panel is Tradition and Innovation in the Visual Arts, and not being a scholar of Chinese art in any way, I decided to focus my comments on tradition and innovation in Western art, and perhaps by contrast, this will illuminate some of the differences between our two cultures and histories, although perhaps some similarities will emerge as well. So conventional art history tells us that in the late 20th century, European and American art, as well as contemporary veins of Asian, Latin American, and African art, underwent a shift from something called modernism, and this is a canonical example of modernist art in the West. This is Barnett Newman's monumental painting Vir Heroicus Sublimis from 1950-51. A very large-scale work. And I'll pause for a moment on this painting just to observe that as my co-panelist, Professor TIAN, was speaking earlier, I sensed a very interesting juxtaposition between this work and one of the works that he showed, specifically the first plum blossom image, the branch with the plum blossom in the shape of the mirror, which he discussed as relating to a kind of introspection. And I think that this painting is a very interesting Western modern corollary to that picture, except without the plum blossom. So without the mirror, which is really critical, because this is not a painting that addresses an individual. It's a painting of the absolute that addresses the absolute. So the painting itself is the mirror. The abstraction is monumental and pure and all-encompassing. So we go from this, supposedly, in the West, modernism, to something called, if I can get this, to postmodernism, characterized in the critical establishment by a painting like this by David Sally, the American artist David Sally. This is a painting called Lanterns from 2002. So this transition was understood to be essentially a shift from innovation to tradition. So that oops. Oh, it's going the wrong way. There we go. So a painting like this would have been seen in the idiom of innovation, of a work of art that essentially created a clean slate. And in this work, it looks both literally as well as figuratively like a clean slate, as if all of history had been washed away in the face of a new understanding of reality. Compared to the canonical postmodern image, which is understood to be, in some respects, a return to tradition, to figuration, for example, to, let's see, to, should have practiced on this. How do I do that? Oh, there we go. Historical art, moments of art from other periods. These nudes, although not exactly respectable perhaps in their underwear, do recall classical traditions of the nude in art. So this was understood to be a shift from innovation to tradition. That is, tradition understood as a selective return to the styles and tropes of the past and a renunciation of modernism's purported demand for an aesthetic clean slate. So postmodernism is seen as a return to tradition, to the past, and a renunciation of the clean slate. In fact, what is called postmodernism did not involve a wholesale reversion to the past, nor to traditions in their originary state, as you can see here. That is, it did not generally involve expressions that merely simulated earlier artistic forms. Rather, postmodernism, through its employment of techniques such as collage and radical juxtaposition, as you see here, was usually understood to carry a critical dimension, critical of modernism, to be sure, of the unitary image of the something like the Barnett-Newman, but also of its own capacity to finally and coherently displace the modernist dream of a fresh beginning. So it's critical of modernism, but also of itself and its own capacities. But just how fresh a beginning did so-called modernism demand? Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, in instances where the idea of modernism is invoked, one finds invocations of continuity as well as rupture, of wholes as well as fractures, of tradition as well as innovation. So the painting here is Edouard Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, Picnic on the Grass, from 1863, a painting that was in its day, and in fact for decades after first being shown, scandalous both in terms of its form and its content. Formally, the areas of unresolved brushwork, the peculiar composition, the figures that are non-perspectival, and in terms of the content, the supposed sort of immoral implications of a nude woman dining with two clothed men. In fact, the Manet painting was based, at least compositionally, on this engraving by Marcantonio Raimondi, a Renaissance artist from 1510, 1520. This is actually a detail of a larger work. This piece itself was in reference to an earlier work by the Renaissance artist Raphael depicting the Judgment of Paris, a mythological subject. And moving forward in the history of so-called modernism, we find Picasso in 1960 representing the very same subject in the Déjeuner sur l'herbe of 1960. So this idea that modernism somehow requires the artist to have a clean slate in every instance, to address the blank canvas as an originary moment, is in fact not really the true story of the odyssey of painting, so-called innovative painting in the 19th and 20th century. So the titanic battle between so-called modernism and so-called postmodernism appears finally to be something of a red herring. So for the translators, essentially a false distinction that has distracted us from a more profound transition in the arts. This alternate understanding has been marvelously described and analyzed by the contemporary French philosopher Jacques Rancière, whose book, The Politics of Aesthetics, among many other influential texts by him, lays out a potentially new way of understanding the artistic eras, at least in Western culture, from the time of the Greeks. Rancière's contribution is to shift the question from one of tradition versus innovation, or in other words, of pre- and postmodern versus modern, to what he calls the distribution of the sensible. The key question for Rancière is not the newness or conventionality of form and content, but rather the degree to which the work in question stems from a democratically empowered producer and contributes to a liberating experience for its makers and audience. Rancière is concerned with who has the power to speak and to make images and who has the power to witness or experience them. He is also concerned with the effect of art, the ways in which its forms and themes serve to challenge the repressive state and social apparatuses and lead to more liberated lives. So Rancière proposes 3 eras, or what he calls regimes, in the history of Western art. The first, the ethical regime, the so-called ethical regime, corresponding to the period of Greek history in which arts were akin to craft and had no special status. And this period, of course, is epitomized by Plato's Republic, in which the arts were described as being beneath the consideration of philosophy and ultimately of no essential value to the ideal community. Second, the representative regime, in which, following the theories of Aristotle, art came to develop its own internal rules and criteria while mirroring in its hierarchies of medium, form, and content the political and social hierarchies of society. So for Rancière, the so-called representative regime carries one from the period of late Greek art up through the 19th century and is sort of the quintessential model of art practice throughout the Renaissance, the Baroque period, and so on. And then finally, in the mid-19th century, he sees the emergence of something called the aesthetic regime, which abolished the Aristotelian hierarchies. So, for example, in what he would call the representative regime, the highest realm might be reserved for history painting, then perhaps portraiture, then landscape, and still life at the bottom. In the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, these hierarchies were abolished. There was a blurring of the boundary between disciplines, most notably between visual art and literature, which was a radical shift in the West. And it's interesting to see, in contrast to some of the speakers we've heard discuss the many thousand-year-old relationship between writing and image making in Chinese culture. When these forms began to merge in the West in the 19th century, it was an earth-shaking transformation. And also that art became radically democratized in its origin and reception. So Rancière's aesthetic regime corresponds temporally, in terms of the time period, with the period ascribed to modernism, that is, from the beginning of the 19th century to the present. And many of the figures he cites, such as Gustave Flaubert and Stéphane Mallarmé. And Mallarmé, this is from 1897, Un coup de dés, or a throw of the dice, is a quintessential example of what Rancière is talking about when he speaks of the blurring of the boundary between text and image in this extraordinary poem in which the author utilizes the empty space of the page, the qualities of typography, to elicit sensations that had heretofore not been available to writing, nor for that matter to visual art. Yet Rancière's standards turn conventional notions of tradition and innovation upside down when we consider a movement such as Soviet constructivism, conventionally considered a paragon of the modernist idiom, which by Rancière's standards would likely fall atemporally under the rubric of the ethical regime, or the early Greek period, insofar as its participants and audiences aspired to a non-exceptional status for artistic objects, united with the products of craft by their shared origin in labor and the vernacular idioms of industrial forms. Rancière's criteria for the aesthetic regime, which he believes dominates the present time, allows for a wide variety of artistic solutions, from situational, interactional performance art to seemingly minimal paintings that challenge the viewer to experience their lives more engagingly and more connected to their fellow citizens. So one of the things that intrigues me about Rancière, if I can get this image to cooperate, having sort of dispensed with very conventional notions of the path of art history, he, reframes the defining terms of the eras or the regimes of art. And the regime that he believes we are in now, the so-called aesthetic regime, interestingly, by his criteria, allows for a really remarkably diverse range of artistic practices, one of which at one end of the spectrum might be a project like this. This was a piece by Jeremy Deller, who is a quite renowned British artist, probably around 40 years old, a winner of the Turner Prize. So very highly considered artist in Britain and internationally. This particular piece consisted of a restaging of a miners' strike, a strike that was a historical incident that occurred in 1984, which was broken up by the British police. And Deller, in 2001, organized 800 people, including actors, but also people from that town who had actually lived through the original strike, to reenact the demonstration and the charges of the police against the demonstrators. And this was the artwork, so to speak, was the reenactment itself. It was a sort of a communal, scripted, performative artwork. And one in which I think, interestingly and crucially, the intent was not to dramatize the ideology of the miners, but rather to create a kind of an opportunity for a conciliatory, almost homeopathic catharsis for all the members of the community, whether they had been on the side of the police or on the side of the miners, to restage this very dramatic and hurtful moment in their community in order to come to some state of shared conciliation. So on the one hand, something like this, and on the other hand, something like this, a painting by the artist Susan Freycon. This is actually from a show that's on view now in New York. If you happen to be in New York in the next few days, you can see this painting at the David Zwirner Gallery. So this is a painting from 2010. You can see, like the Barnett Newman we saw before, this painting is also obviously abstract. We could call it minimal, geometric. It's critically different, however, in a number of important ways, unfortunately, some of which are not immediately apparent in this image. For one thing, she only allows the painting to be exhibited in natural light, so there is no artificial light on the painting, and so one's experience of the work is contingent. It is not absolute. It varies according to the cloud cover, to the time of day, to one's position in relationship to the work. So one is reminded continually of one's individuality, one's contingency, and one's humanness, if you will, and also because of the different treatments in the surface of the painting. Some areas are very matte, some are shiny. The painting itself catches the light in very different ways and helps to additionally heighten this sense that light is this medium in which we're all swimming collectively. This is another work by Susan Freycon, done, she works simultaneously in these two media, large-scale oil painting and small-scale watercolor. This piece is probably just a few inches by a few inches. So informal as almost to not be art at all. And I think one of the things that connects Susan Freycon with Jeremy Deller is this way in which they're pushing art to its outer boundaries, to this sort of liminal point where it touches on the non-artistic, on the realm of pure material or the purely social or the purely political, but still stays within something that could be considered art, but playing at that boundary. Finally, to summarize, by shifting the framing language, Rancière has allowed us to focus on what art does rather than on what it appears to be. Thank you.